This will be just about all I know about my grandfather, Monroe. Monroe Howard Neal was born December 1879 in Irish Township, Clinton County, Illinois. His father, William C. Neal, and his mother, Melvina Hinchy, normally lived in Kentucky, but for a short time they moved to Irish Town. The town was named that because it was first settled by the sons of the Emerald Isle. The township is along Carlisle Lake. Irish Town is situated on an elbow of the Kaskaskia River, on the west side, about in the middle of the lake. In the 2020 census, the population was only 1,036. To get your bearings, the town of Carlisle is at the southwest tip of the lake. Monroe's twin, Nettie, shows up in the 1880 census as 6 months old. There are no 1890 census records, so by the 1900 records, there is no mention of Nettie. So she either died or was working outside the home, which would be normal because they were almost 20 years old. I went down a rabbit hole with Nettie marrying a man named Job, who was a perpetual bigamist. The woman fit the area and the age, but that's another story. Monroe had a very large extended family, his mother being the third wife of his father, William. Together, William and Melvina had 9 children, so Monroe had 8 full brothers and sisters. He had 7 half-brothers and sisters with his father, William, and Lucinda, his father's first wife. And rumor has it he had at least one other sibling with William's second wife, Sarah Dors. So Monroe grew up with a very large family, although most of his siblings were all grown up by the time he was born. It is said the siblings were not close due to age and geographical distance from each other. In the 1900 census, Monroe was living in Central City, Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. He was 19, and already his occupation was coal miner. He could read and write, and he was living with Melvina, his mom, and Owen was 26, Emmett 23, David 16, Jenny 12, William C. 10, and Alice Neal, 9 years of age. William Charles, his father, was recorded in the ancestry as being 10, but I looked up the census, and a lot of times they're really hard to read, and he was actually 70. So William C. was the head of the household. Melvina was 19 years younger than William. 10 years later, in 1910, Melvina was living with her son Owen and considered a widow. Now back to Monroe. He married Pearl Wright January 29, 1902, in Central City, Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. Pearl was born in 1883, so she was about 3 years younger than Monroe. They had 10 children. Their first daughter, Mary, was born in 1903, and they had her baptized in the Catholic Church, which was a surprise because the Neals were always Protestant. So Pearl must have been a Catholic. So their first child, Mary, was born in Illinois. So that means they moved from Kentucky to Illinois the first year of their marriage. Family members of both sides lived in Staunton and the Olive Township area. So to be near family, they moved to Williamson, Illinois, which is between Livingston and Staunton, and Monroe began to work in the coal mine there. There was a 5-year lull between children, so I believe that during this time, Pearl could have had 2 boys who died in infancy, according to the family story. The second daughter, Stella, was born in 1908. Lee, I knew her as Goldie, was born in 1912. She is one of the sisters I remember from my childhood. The next daughter was Mildred, born 1913. She lived to be almost 100 years old. Dolores was born in 1915. The next daughter, Beatrice Eleanor, was a sad story. She lived 1 year and died during the pandemic of 1917, or the Spanish flu. Uncle Everett was born in 1920, and my father, Monroe H. Neal, was born in 1922. He went by Monroe Howard Neal Jr. sometimes. His sister said his middle name was Harrison. Everett's middle name was Howard. Grandma Pearl Wright died in 1936. She was suffering from gallbladder trouble for 16 years, according to her death certificate. She died in the Litchfield Hospital during an operation to remove her gallbladder. Grandpa Monroe always worked at the coal mine in one job or another. He was the foreman of the mine when a young man was killed, and he had to testify about the death at the inquest along with 4 other men. Later, according to the 1940 census, he worked in the storage room at the coal mine. The census said that he went through 8th grade, and Monroe Howard Jr. was 18 and working for the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. Monroe Jr., or my father, had quit high school in February at his birthday when he had only a few months left until he graduated. Mom said it was because she wouldn't marry him. All that's another story. An interesting note is that when Grandma Pearl died, they lived in Staunton. The address is on the death certificate. 4 years later, Grandpa Monroe lived in Williamson, the next town, only 3 doors from his daughter, my Aunt Mary Ballstrom. All his children called him Pop. He had a hard life working at the mine and losing his wife when she was only 53. When he died, he was staying with his son, my Uncle Everett, in Chicago. His body was sent back to Staunton, and he was buried with Grandma Pearl in the Memorial Park Cemetery. I was able to get the death certificate from Chicago. It said he died from multiple myeloma. It read, interval between onset and death was 10 days. Stella had to be in Chicago at that time because she answered the questions for the death certificate. She didn't know his mother's name and said his father's name was James, which is incorrect. So obviously, she didn't know much about the family. Of course, we know his father was William Charles Neal and his mother's name was Melvina Hinchy. She lived with Stella's Uncle Owen near Staunton in Sawyerville at the end of her life, and she was buried in Staunton Memorial Park Cemetery also. And I guess she never met Stella, who was her granddaughter, which I find hard to believe. Grandpa Monroe wasn't staying in Chicago with Everett for very long. I know that because I have seen him in the newspapers that he was admitted to Staunton Hospital just months before he died. He must have been a very loved man because he had over 100 people attend his funeral and sign the book. One of his sisters, who had very nice handwriting I might add, wrote a bit about his life. I will read it verbatim. Monroe Neal Sr., son of the late Charles and Melvina Neal, was born December 1st, 1879 in Carlisle, Illinois, and passed away at the home of his son, Everett H. Neal, on Friday, August 26, 1955 at 10 o'clock a.m., having attained the age of 75 years, 8 months, and 25 days. On January 27, 1902, he was married to Pearl Wright at Central City, Kentucky, and to this union were born 6 girls and 4 boys. For many years he was employed at the Mount Olive Staunton Coal Company and was a member of the Local 37 PMW of A. Surviving are 5 daughters, Mrs. Mary Ballstrom and Mrs. Estella Spicer of Williamson, Mrs. Goldie Darlin, Mrs. Mildred Robertson, Mrs. Dolores Howe, all of Chicago. 2 sons, Everett Neal of Chicago, Monroe Neal of Kansas City, Kansas. 17 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, 2 brothers, Dave Neal of Mount Olive, Illinois, Owen Neal of Sawyerville, 1 sister, Mrs. Jenny Lambert of Woodview, Illinois. Several more distant relatives, as well as a host of friends. His wife preceded him in death December 31st, 1936. Also, 1 daughter and 2 sons died in infancy. I never met Grandma Pearl. Of course, she died in 1936, and I was a baby when Grandpa Neal died. I remember seeing their original tombstone in the cemetery, but it's long gone now. Someone bought a memorial stone for them, which my cousin Greg said was my father, Monroe, Jr., who bought it. I never knew that. The memorial stone must have been covered with sod the last time I visited the cemetery because I never found it. A nice person took a picture of their gravestone and put it on Find a Grave. I vaguely remember the original stone and that near it was a reference to Eleanor, their little girl who died of the Spanish flu. I never met Aunt Stella or have a picture of her. I met Goldie many times. She used to visit my father and us, the huge family. I remember her as being bigger than life, vivacious, blonde, and very kind. She looked a lot like my father, but I don't have a photo of her either. I only met Aunt Mildred maybe 3 times. She seemed to be the level-headed one. She lived to be almost 100 years old. She kept in touch with my mother after my father died, which was for decades. He died in 1975 at 53 years old, and Mom lived to be 93. Aunt Mildred sent Mom these pictures. She danced until the end. She was a very nice person. Aunt Mary was a fabulous cook, according to my siblings who visited her and tasted her ham and beans, and I'm sure cornbread. My father visited her whenever we went to Grandma's house. Grandma Uher was a fabulous cook also, but her food was totally different, Central European food. Aunt Mary's was more American country. My father usually took the older kids of the family over to Aunt Mary's. She lived in the tiny town of Williamson, which was between Livingston, where Grandma Uher lived, and the big town of Staunton. All I recall of Aunt Mary was her salt and pepper shaker collection and her puckered pillows and ruffled lampshades. I went there once, and she was sitting under a tree with her dog, an English setter, white with black spots, a gorgeous dog. I never really spoke to Dolores, although she was at the family reunion 25 or so years ago. Tons of people were there. I saw Uncle Everett a lot. He was a character. It would take a book to describe him. I think I covered them all. The last image will be a list of Grandpa Monroe's 15 siblings. Now this is the story my mother told. She said that Pop, she called him Pop, was a drinker. And she said that her husband-to-be sent home money from the war, because he was a Marine and he was in the Pacific. He sent home money for her to be able to get an engagement ring. And she said all she had was $100 because she said Pop drank the rest. Anyway, I don't know if that's true or not. If he sent home more than $100, because I don't know how much they made in the Marines at that time. But anyway, that was her story. So many stories, so little time.